In this set of notes, we have two goals. The first, homeostatic mechanisms, how they work, what they are, the components. And second, the role of positive and negative feedback in maintaining homeostasis or taking us out of homeostasis. So, first and foremost, homeostasis is simply the adjustment, the constant adjustment that is occurring in living things based on changes to the environment or changes to the internal environment. Most obvious examples, when you're hot, you sweat. When you're cold, you shiver. All of this is a response by your body based on changing conditions to maintain a constant body temperature. And the most important thing to remember is it's not that it's a constant temperature, but it's a range. So when I get too hot, I sweat. If I get too cold, I shiver. And so our body temperature is constantly adjusting to stay in the general area, to stay between extremes. In biology, we call this a dynamic equilibrium. In other words, it works just like your home heater. When the room temperature rises or hits a certain point, it can turn on the heater, heat gets produced, that actually turns it off, then the temperature drops, it goes back and forth. So you have this constant change in temperature, but you're maintaining the temperature around between 70 and 75, depending on where you keep your heater set in your house. The thing to recognize is ultimately when we talk homeostasis, we're talking about regulation. Another way to think about it is cruise control. When you're on the highway and you set the cruise, if you're going uphill, your car automatically adds a little gas. You can actually feel the car accelerate a little bit to maintain that constant speed as it goes uphill. Once you're going back downhill, the car actually lets off the accelerator and the car maintains the same speed but with less gas. And that's regulation. That's what's going on with homeostasis. So homeostasis has to be maintained for the body to function well. If we get outside the body temperature norms, if we get outside blood pH norms, anything that's too high or too low has dramatic effects on the body. And any kind of long-term homeostatic imbalance always results in death and disease. Now, imbalance is normal, okay? Everything's an imbalance. As I showed you in that first little thing, we have a constant imbalance occurring. But long-term imbalance is what will result in death or disease. But we have a constant change. That's how we maintain homeostasis. That's how we maintain or regulate what's going on in the body. There are ultimately two mechanisms of regulation. What's known as autoregulation or intrinsic regulation, and then what's known as extrinsic regulation. Now, autoregulation, so the basic definition, a cell, tissue, or organ makes the change or changes or causes the change. Typically, this involves metabolic needs impacting blood flow. So let's say you have a group of cells or tissues that need more oxygen. They literally can cause vasodilation of the vessels. They can cause the vessels to expand so more blood flows to their area, bringing more oxygen. So that's basic autoregulation. Extrinsic regulation is what we are more familiar with. It's the idea of the nervous system or the endocrine system causing a change in a cell, an organ, or a group of tissue. And this impacts multiple systems. For example, when you exercise, there are changes to your heart rate, there's changes to the blood vessel dilation in muscles, there's changes to your breathing rate, there's changes to how your body temperature is maintained because suddenly you're exercising and the temperature rises, so you have to sweat. So there's all kinds of things being adjusted. And in fact, if the muscles are requiring blood because they need more oxygen, that means you can actually shut off or slow down the blood flow to areas that don't require it, like your digestive system, things like that. So when we're maintaining homeostasis or when we are trying to regulate things, so keep in mind, homeostasis is all about regulation. Think about it again like maintaining cruise control. There's three parts. You have a receptor, you have a control center, and you have an effector. Now, the receptor is what recognizes the change. It has to be able to respond to the stimulus. So remember that in one of the previous notes, we talked about the ability to respond to stimuli. That's huge here. If you don't know anything's changed, you can't respond to it. It's sort of like if you're in the sun and you don't know it's too hot and your body doesn't sweat, you start kind of cooking. You get heat stroke. Ultimately, what the receptor does is it notices this change and it sends the information on. okay, what's known as an afferent pathway. It's sending information in. The second part is our control center. This is the integration. This is where things are figured out. This is where the response is determined. Kind of a rather crude analogy. People that have a filter or don't have a filter on their mouth, in other words, the mouth works before the brain kicks in. The brain needs to kick in before the mouth opens. So in this case, we actually need the right response. If you're hot, you don't want to start shivering because that would increase the temperature. If you're cold, you don't want to start sweating because that would actually make you cool off more. So the right response is what the whole point of the integration center, the whole point of the control center is. It figures out, okay, this is what information's here, this is what the appropriate response is, and then it sends that response to the effector. So notice that we have information in and information out. So this was the afferent pathway. This is what's known as the efferent pathway, and it's going to the effector. It's whatever carries out the response. And it's most commonly you're looking at glands or muscles. So again, if I'm hot, signal's going to get sent to the sweat glands. They'll start producing sweat. Eventually the body cools off. So again, the efferent pathway, that exit, carries out the response determined by the control center. So again, once more, the receptor, the control center, and the effector are how we maintain homeostasis. We have to be able to sense the change. We have to be able to determine what's the best way to respond to that change, and then we have to have something carrying out our response. Now, again, what's interesting here is this produces a feedback system. So we have the control center, we have the receptor figuring out what's going on, sends the information to the control center. The control center produces a response, the effector carries it out. But we have to have a way of monitoring the change to decide, okay, do I need to keep this signal going or do I need to stop it? Again, if you are hot and you sweat and you cool off, you don't want to keep sweating and get too cold. You need to stop at a certain point. So this feedback system is how we determine, do I need to stop or keep going? And that's ultimately what's going on, is we have to be able to monitor that response. We have to be able to monitor the change. If nothing else, think of it like this. When you threw a ball when you were 3 versus when you throw a ball now, your motion is very different. Your body actually over time figured out what it should do versus what you did do, and it made changes. And now you can throw a ball without really thinking about it. And ultimately, the whole point of monitoring is to know, did the change work? If it didn't work, keep going. If it did work, then we stop. I need to add going, don't I? And that's ultimately what's going on. And that's what it means to monitor, is we're just looking at, did the change make the response, did it produce the change we needed? So if you, again, I'm beating a dead horse here, I realize that, but if you sweat and you're still producing heat, you're going to keep sweating because you still need to cool off. At a certain point, you stop sweating. It's not like once you start sweating, you keep going. So at a certain point, we stop what's going on. Now, this feedback, this monitoring, because that's ultimately, did it work? That's our feedback. It either opposes or enhances the stimulus. Okay. Anything else, when we talk about opposing or enhancing the stimulus, think about us going a particular speed. So we have our little car. Don't mock my drawing. It's sort of there. Okay. So my car is speeding along, right? If I want to oppose the speed, then I apply the brakes and I slow down. If I want to enhance my speed, I hit the gas and I speed up. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the effective feedback. The effective feedback either applies brakes or it applies more gas. Okay? So first and foremost, negative feedback. Think of negative feedback as the opposite. It's the brakes that stop a moving car. So it shuts off or reduces the intensity of the initial thing. Again, I'm hot, sweating reduces the heat. So that's a negative feedback mechanism. Most of our homeostatic control mechanisms operate on this idea of opposing or stopping the initial stimulus. We want to slow it down. We want to make it less. Whereas positive feedback is increasing it. So I'm speeding along and I accelerate. And if I accelerate, my car goes faster. So I was already going fast, and now I apply the gas pedal and I'm going faster. So that's positive feedback. It makes it more. This is really important in the body in terms of blood clotting, birthing a baby. Now, we see, unfortunately, a lot of things, positive feedback is actually negative. So these are two big positives. The birth of a baby, think of it this way. You have contractions that are getting stronger and closer together because we need to get the baby out. At a certain point, the baby can't survive in the mother's womb because it's going to starve to death. It can no longer get enough nutrients to live. So that's why birth has to occur. So to get the baby out, the contractions around the uterus become greater, stronger, and more frequent to help push that baby out. That's a positive feedback. I'm continually increasing the initial stimulus. So I have a contraction that's very small a few times, then I get another contraction, then I get another contraction, and stronger and closer together, and so that's positive feedback. The same thing with blood clotting. If you're bleeding, you need that blood to stop flowing in that wherever that area is. So the formation of a clot is actually a positive feedback. We need to cause platelets to stick together and more platelets to stick together and more platelets to stick together to stop blood escaping a vessel. Now, obviously, in situations other than clotting and the birth of a baby, making something go faster that shouldn't is considered a bad thing. So oftentimes positive feedback increases or exacerbates or makes worse the homeostatic imbalance that has occurred. And if I make a homeostatic imbalance worse, then that's what leads to death and disease. And that's actually what's going on in most diseases, is my homeostatic imbalance is even more, and ultimately something went on with the regulation. Something went wrong, and regulation is no longer occurring the way it should. Happens a lot with various genetic diseases and things like that. So again, with homeostatic imbalances, it's a completely normal thing. It's part of that dynamic equilibrium, but if it's a long term, we always get disease and death, and most of the time a positive feedback makes the long-term instability worse. In addition, with age, we generally become less efficient, and with less efficiency, there's less stability. So those changes in homeostatic imbalance may become worse and or even greater in intensity, and that instability can lead to death or disease. So once more, the whole point of this video was to make sure you understood homeostatic mechanisms, and hopefully you feel a little more comfortable describing the role of positive and negative feedback within that homeostatic mechanism.